So I decided to talk about the VAKT technique, which is a visual, auditory, kinesthetic, tactile technique, and it's used to concentrate on word learning skills, and it's a great tool to use because it focuses on all the different modalities, the multiple modalities, being visual, auditory, kinesthetic, being body, using your body, and tactile. Personally, I use a lot of tactile approaches in my classroom. I teach learning support, so I'm used to students who have difficulty word learning. I use sand a lot. We'll write our power words in sand. So that's something that I've used in the past, but after learning this approach, I think that this might be more beneficial to some of my students. It's adapted from the Fernald tracing technique, which is a tier 3 intervention. So it's used on our most troublesome students, the ones that are having the most difficult time. It's pretty much used as a last resort. It's a language experience approach, which is huge, and the students love doing things like that. But once again, it's for the students who are having the most difficulties, your really serious problems. There are some prerequisites that need to be in place though. The student needs to be able to hear, see, say, and trace the word before they could be put into this program. They'd also need to be able to form the letters correctly. Since we will be tracing with our fingers, we would not want the students to keep forming words incorrectly, so we'd like to have the formation of letters pretty solid. So the first thing we would do is introduce the procedures and show how it works, and tell the student, I've used this with other students and it's helped them learn to read, and I can't wait to help you now. Be very energetic and very positive. It's a big part of it. The student will see that and they will then be excited as well. So I would continue to establish some rapport with my student. Something I would need to find out is whether they're right or left-handed. That depends on where we sit, and I should have mentioned this. Typically, I have flexible seating in my classroom, which is why we're sitting on milk crates. But for something like this, I would still let the students pick their seat, but I would make sure that it's somewhere where we could both sit together, not just a one-person seat. So I think this table would be a good place to do that. You need to figure out if they're right or left-handed, so that depends on where you would sit on which side of the student. Another thing you need to know is whether you'll be using cursive or manuscript writing. For most of my students, cursive is not an option, so we would use manuscript, although cursive is more recommended because of the flow of writing it. You don't have to keep picking your fingers up. So then once that's figured out, I would tell the student, all right, here we go. I'm really excited to start. I want you to suggest the first word we're going to learn. That gives them ownership of their learning, it lets them know I'm in control too, and this is something I'm going to be proud of, so I'm going to work my hardest towards it. So new words are always looked up in the dictionary. So here I have a children's dictionary. For my students, most students that are in this program are our most severe learners, so we would not expect them to know where the word would be in the dictionary. So for example, if my student said baseball, I want to learn how to spell baseball, I wouldn't expect him to be able to find baseball on the first try, so I would say, what sound does baseball start with? B, ba, great. We would find it together, and I would write it down. I would write it down on a strip of paper with a black crayon. It also recommends a black marker, but I noticed as I kept writing, you could see through on the other side of the paper, which we need for later on, so a crayon didn't show through as much, so that's what I chose to use. I would write the word syllable by syllable, base, ball, as I'm writing it. After I've written it, I would underline the syllables base and ball to separate the different syllables. The next thing, I would give the word to the student and they would begin tracing it. So the student's going to trace this word until they feel comfortable enough that they can write it from memory. So when they're tracing it first, they would say the word baseball. He would trace it, base, ball. As we're going, since we're using manuscript, we'll cross our T's and dot our I's. If you're using cursive, you'll write the word and then go back and cross your T's and dot your I's. And then the student says the word again. So they'll say it, say the syllables, dot the T's, cross the I's, dot the I's, cross the T's, and say the word one more time. If the student makes a mistake during this process, it's really important that we stop them and back up and correct the mistake so that we don't encourage the same mistake to be made. So we'd like to eliminate the mistakes as soon as they happen. Also, if I'm feeling that a student hasn't traced it enough to know it by memory, I can suggest that they keep tracing it so that they have a better knowledge of the word. When the student feels comfortable enough, it's time to write the word from memory. So they'll have to write it 2 times. The first time they'll write it across the top of the paper, Then they'll check it against my copy. If it's correct, we'll cover up their word with the flipped over my copy, and they'll write it one more time. If they get the word correct, we'll staple them together and we'll put them in a file for them. If they don't, we can start the tracing process over again, and we can go from there. Always keep records of this when you're doing it with students. You know, how many times they traced it, are they tracing it correctly, how many times did they write it from memory, did they write it partially from memory, you know, things like that. It's just very good, accurate data to keep on these kids to see what we can improve on with them. The next thing we could do is write a story together, compose a story. So I chose to picture I was working with one of my students. One in particular who is in 4th grade. I teach 3rd and 4th grade learning support, so he is a 4th grade student of mine who is on a yellow reading level. We use the American Reading Company, and the yellow level is pretty much equivalent to a preschool kindergarten level. So he's pretty far behind. I would consider him my most severe case, so he's who I had in mind as we were doing this. His birthday just came up, so I figured maybe he'd like to write a story about his birthday party. So I figured our story could be entitled My Birthday Party. I know that he can write the word my, so he would write my as his title. He might have a problem spelling the word birthday, so I would say, what sound does birthday start with? He can say B, B, awesome. We'll flip to this section. We'll flip to the letter B. We'll find birthday together, and here it is, birthday. I would then write it on my strip. I did in crayon again just because I didn't want you to be able to see through when we use it later. So I wrote birthday, I underlined the syllables birthday. I'm going to point them out in the dictionary too. Here's the syllables birth and day. So once we've gotten that out of the way, I'll give it to my student. He can trace birthday with his ring and pointer fingers, and he will say the word birthday. He can trace birth, day, birthday. And we crossed our T as we went, and we dotted our I as we went because we're using manuscript. If he made a mistake, I'd have him start over. Once he's confident enough to write it from memory, I would give him his paper. He would write it across the top. If it was correct, I'd flip my copy over to cover the top word, and he can write it again. Something else I would definitely do with my students, since I teach supplemental learning support, I don't have them all day long. I like to make portable word walls with them so they can use these words in their other classes as well. So I would staple the 2 copies together, my copy and his copy, and I would put it in a personal word wall for him so that if he ever needs to write this word again, he knows that he has it ready to go. I know that this is definitely an approach that I'm going to begin using in my classroom, mostly because I teach learning support and I have a lot of struggling readers, and I think that this is just one extra component that we can put in place that would help them be able to learn these words, because the student I was particularly talking about, you know, we have power words instead of our sight words, but we've been doing our power words every day in school. He practiced them at home every night, and he comes back the next day and still does not know them. So this is definitely something that I think would be beneficial to him. Also, after we had written our whole story, I got a little ahead of myself. After we'd written our whole story, I would then type up a list of all the words that we just learned, and I would review them with him the next day. Typically, that's when I see the problem, is following through the next day, so it's great that this has that follow-up piece already built in. But this is definitely something I would love to begin using as soon as possible to add to my tactile approaches.